I was discreetly escorting a criminal suspect onto a plane mid-flight. A flight attendant approached the suspect and started chatting him up. I suddenly warned her of the danger and requested a secluded corner away from other passengers for us. To my surprise, the flight attendant scoffed at me. "Hey, is this your private plane? You think you can sit wherever you want? I'm just talking to a handsome guy. What are you so jealous about seeing her unreasonable behavior?" I called the chief flight attendant to intervene. But the flight attendant started crying, claiming I was bullying her, which drew sympathy from other passengers. I was utterly speechless. What she didn't know was that this suspect wasn't an ordinary criminal. He was extremely dangerous. During our argument, the suspect suddenly erupted, grabbed the flight attendant, and demanded the plane turned back. But here is where everything changes from what I initially believed. Because the flight attendant, who had been crying and playing the victim, was not a victim at all. She had been waiting for this exact moment. The tears, the outrage, the performance, it was all designed to get close enough to touch the handcuffs. I'm a detective, and I'd spent 3 months undercover pouring all my energy into finally capturing a nationally notorious criminal named Victor for my superior's orders. I was secretly escorting him back to state headquarters. Before boarding, my director repeatedly emphasized the need for complete discretion under no circumstances, revealing Victor's identity to avoid panic. Among passengers, I tucked away my badge and handcuffs, then sat down next to Victor while warning him to behave and not pull any stunts. My gaze swept alertly over everyone in the airport, not daring to relax for a second. The airport was crowded that morning, and every face looked suspicious to me. I had been undercover for so long that I had forgotten what normal felt like. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the announcements echoed across the concourse. I watched passengers rush past, some laughing, some stressed, some completely unaware that a dangerous criminal was walking among them. Victor kept his head down, his shoulders relaxed, as if he was just another tired traveler. But I knew better. I had spent 3 months inside his organization. 3 months watching him charm and manipulate. 3 months waiting for the moment I could finally bring him in. I had infiltrated Victor's organization by posing as a freelance courier who handled sensitive deliveries for various criminal enterprises. It was a dangerous role because one mistake would have gotten me killed, but I was careful, methodical, and patient. I built relationships with the lower-level members of his network, slowly earning their trust until I was finally introduced to Victor himself. The first time I met him, I was struck by how ordinary he seemed. He was tall, but not imposing. He had kind eyes and a gentle smile. He could have been a teacher or a doctor or anyone you would trust with your children. But I knew better. I had read his file. I knew what he had done. The bodies, the betrayals, the lives he had destroyed. Victor was a monster, disguised as a man. Over the next 3 months, I watched him carefully. I learned his habits, his preferences, his weaknesses. He was vain and arrogant. He loved being the smartest person in the room. He couldn't resist showing off his intelligence, even when it was dangerous for him to do so. That was the flaw I planned to exploit. When the time came to arrest him, it happened in a crowded warehouse during what was supposed to be a routine supply transfer. My team moved in fast, and Victor didn't have time to react. I had him in cuffs before he could reach for his weapon. "You're good," he said, as we let him out. "You almost fooled me." I said nothing, but I felt a small flicker of satisfaction. Now, on the plane, I was beginning to realize that Victor had been planning his escape long before the arrest. The handcuffs, the flight attendant, the extraction team, it had all been arranged in advance. I had been so focused on the arrest that I had missed the bigger picture. What I didn't know was that Victor had been waiting for this flight for weeks. His network had infiltrated the airline. They had placed someone on this specific crew, someone who would make contact at exactly the right moment, someone who would create enough chaos to give him the opening he needed. The flight attendant's name was Sophie, and she had been recruited by Victor's organization 3 years earlier. She had climbed the ranks of the airline, slowly, carefully earning promotions and trust. She had never met Victor in person before, but she had memorized every detail of the plan. The signal was simple. When Victor ran his left hand through his hair 3 times, she would know it was time to act. He had done that gesture twice during the meal service. I hadn't noticed because I was too focused on watching the other passengers, but Sophie saw it, and she had been waiting for the 3rd signal. When it came, she launched her performance. She flirted outrageously, challenged me openly, and cried on command. It was a masterpiece of manipulation designed to get my attention off Victor and onto her long enough for him to do what he needed to do. And what he needed to do was finish what he had started hours earlier. The handcuffs connecting us had been subtly compromised before we even boarded. During his transfer from the holding facility to the transport van, Victor had been given a small folded piece of high-strength wire wrapped in a piece of gum. The guards were thorough, but they didn't check the inside of his mouth. He had worked the wire against the internal lock mechanism of his cuff during the entire drive to the airport, slowly, patiently, methodically. He had weakened the locking pin by a fraction of a millimeter with every careful movement. By the time we boarded, the cuff on his wrist was hanging on by a thread. The lock had been scraped and scored from the inside, but it still appeared intact to anyone who looked at it. When Sophie grabbed the handcuffs during our struggle, she wasn't trying to break them. She was providing the final pressure Victor needed. The wire had done most of the work. She simply added the last bit of torque that sheared the weakened metal. The handcuffs didn't break because she was strong. They broke because Victor had already broken them from the inside. I stumbled backward from the sudden release, and for one terrible second, everything went silent. Victor stood up slowly, his wrists free, and his face transformed. The lazy, charming smile that had occupied his features for the last 3 hours evaporated, replaced by something cold and ancient. His eyes no longer pretended to be warm. They were flat, dead, and calculating. Sophie stepped back from him, her performance over. She was no longer crying, she was smiling. A cold, professional smile that told me everything I needed to know. I should have known, I whispered. You should have, Sophie agreed. Her voice was completely different now. All the breathless girlishness was gone, replaced by a calm, steady confidence. The flight attendant was a role. The person standing in front of me was a professional operative, and she had just handed Victor his freedom. The passengers who had been so vocal in their support of Sophie moments ago stared in confusion. The middle-aged man who had offered to write a letter to the airline opened his mouth to speak, then closed it when he saw the look on Sophie's face. The professional woman who had accused me of jealousy slowly lowered her phone. Victor reached up and pulled a small folded blade from inside Sophie's sleeve. She had passed it to him during our struggle, concealed in the palm of her hand. He flicked it open and cut the remaining strap of the broken handcuff from my wrist. Thank you, Victor said to Sophie, his voice low and warm. Now we go to the cockpit. Sophie nodded and walked toward the flight deck as if she did this every day. Victor followed her, gun in hand, and I watched helplessly as they moved past the frozen passengers. But Sophie didn't stop at the cockpit door. She walked past it and headed toward the rear of the plane. Victor paused. What are you doing? Sophie turned and smiled. We're not taking the cockpit, Victor. The extraction is coming from the back. She pressed a button on the service intercom and said 3 words into it. The cargo hold is ready. The passengers gasped. I turned my head and watched as the floor beneath the rear galley began to shift. The cargo hatch had been modified, a hidden panel leading down to the baggage compartment, where someone had been waiting the entire flight. A man emerged from below wearing a dark jumpsuit and carrying a compact assault rifle. He was Victor's backup, who had been hiding in the cargo hold for the entire flight, smuggled aboard during the loading process by the same network that had placed Sophie on the crew. Victor grinned at me over his shoulder. You know, Detective, I told you I didn't need Lorenzo anymore. I sat frozen in my seat. My mind raced. 3 months of undercover work, 3 months of building a case, 3 months of pretending to be someone else. And now Victor was slipping through my fingers with the help of a flight attendant who had been playing a longer game than I ever imagined. But I still had one advantage: they didn't know me as well as they thought they did. I had spent years learning to read people, to anticipate their moves, to find the hidden weaknesses in any plan. Sophie had played her role perfectly, but she had made one mistake. She had assumed I was just another detective following orders. She didn't know that I had trained in high-altitude operations and aircraft security protocols for years before going undercover. I reached under my seat and found what I was looking for. The passenger safety card was still tucked into the seat pocket, but beneath it was something else: the emergency oxygen control panel for the passenger cabin. I didn't need to fight Victor with my hands, I needed to fight him with the plane itself. I reached down and pulled the emergency oxygen override. The system was designed to deploy masks in the event of cabin depressurization, but it also had a secondary function rarely used during emergencies. It could cut off the oxygen supply to specific sections of the cabin. I targeted the rear galley area where Victor and his accomplices were standing. The effect was immediate. The 3 of them staggered as the air around them became thin. Victor's eyes widened as he realized what was happening. He tried to take a step, but his body was already struggling for air. The assault rifle clattered to the floor. The accomplice in the jumpsuit dropped to his knees. His hands went to his throat. Sophie stumbled backward, her face pale with shock. I stood up and walked toward them slowly, calmly. You can't breathe, can you? I said. I cut off the oxygen to your section of the cabin. You have about 30 seconds before you start losing consciousness. Victor tried to raise his gun, but his arm was shaking badly. His body was screaming for air, and his brain was too starved of oxygen to coordinate his movements. I stepped forward and knocked the weapon from his hand. It clattered onto the floor beside the assault rifle. The passengers watched in stunned silence as I pulled Victor to the ground and secured him with the flex cuffs I had hidden in my pocket. The accomplice was already unconscious. Sophie was gasping on the floor, her face turning red. I reached up and restored the oxygen flow. The cabin returned to normal within seconds, and the 3 of them slowly began to recover. Sophie looked up at me with hatred in her eyes. You planned this, I said. You were never a victim. You were the trap. But you forgot that the trap can always be turned around if you know how the plane works. The rest of the flight passed in a blur of chaos and procedure. I secured Victor and his accomplices in separate seats, kept them under constant supervision, and coordinated with the cockpit to redirect the flight to the nearest secure landing site. When we landed, the tarmac was swarming with federal agents. Sophie was taken into custody without a word. Victor was silent, his eyes never leaving mine as they led him away. The accomplice in the jumpsuit was carried off on a stretcher, still struggling to breathe. My director met me at the gate. His face was pale with shock, and something that looked almost like pride. 3 months of undercover work, I said, and it almost fell apart because of one flight attendant with a longer game than I expected. He nodded. We'll need a full debriefing, of course. But first I think you need to know something. He handed me a file. The investigation into Victor's network had expanded while I was in the air. They had identified Sophie and her accomplices weeks ago, but they hadn't been able to act because they needed proof of her involvement in a live operation. You were the bait, I said flatly. My director didn't flinch. You were the only one who could get close enough to force her hand. You didn't know because if you had known, you might have acted differently. I looked down at the file, then back at the tarmac where Victor was being loaded into a transport van. Get me a coffee, I said. I have a long report to write. Later that night, I sat in the debriefing room staring at the wall. The events of the day replayed in my mind over and over, Victor's cold smile. Sophie's transformation the moment I realized I had been used as bait by my own people. But also the moment I had taken control, the moment when I had stopped being a pawn and started being a player again. The coffee in my hands had gone cold hours ago, but I barely noticed. My director came in and sat across from me. You did good work out there. I know. He paused. The flight attendant, Sophie, she's been talking. She said you handled the situation well, calm and decisive. I almost laughed. She tried to kill me 3 times before I turned off her oxygen. She said you didn't panic. She said you were the only person on that plane who knew what they were doing. I looked up at him. You want me to feel better about this? I want you to know that you survived something that would have broken most people. I stared at him for a long moment. Then I reached for my report and continued writing. 3 weeks later, I was back in my office staring at a new case file. Victor had been transferred to a maximum security facility. Sophie was awaiting trial, and I was still trying to process everything that had happened. The door opened, and my partner walked in with a cup of coffee. You look like you haven't slept in days. I haven't. He set the coffee down and sat across from me. You know what happened on that flight wasn't your fault. I didn't blame myself. I blamed Victor and Sophie and everyone else who thought they could use a plane full of innocent people as a stage for their escape. But I also blamed myself for not seeing the signs earlier. I picked up the coffee and took a sip. It was cold, but I didn't care. We have a new case, I said, opening the file in front of me. My partner leaned forward. What kind of case? The kind where the bad guys think they're smarter than everyone else. He nodded, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not peace exactly, but something close enough. I hadn't planned the oxygen override until the last moment. I hadn't known if it would work. I hadn't known if I could pull it off without hurting anyone. But I had done it. And now I was sitting in my office with a cold cup of coffee and a new case file. The flight attendant, Sophie, had been part of something much larger than a single escape attempt. She was part of a network that had been operating for years, quietly placing agents in positions of trust within the transportation sector. Victor was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. But I had stopped her, I had stopped Victor, and I would keep stopping them until the network was dismantled. I looked at my partner and said, I want to take the lead on this one. He grinned. I thought you'd never ask. I grew up in a family of law enforcement officers. My father was a detective, my mother a crime scene analyst, and my older brother a federal agent. I never had a choice about what I would become. It was in my blood from the beginning. I spent my childhood learning how to read people, how to spot inconsistencies, how to stay calm in chaotic situations. By the time I was 18, I had already memorized the signs of deception, the micro-expressions that gave away guilt, the subtle shifts in posture that preceded violence. I joined the academy at 19 and graduated at the top of my class. But nothing prepared me for Victor. I had been tracking him for 2 years before I went undercover. He was a ghost, a shadow, a man who seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere at the same time. His network spanned 3 countries, and his influence reached into the highest levels of organized crime. He had never been photographed, never been caught, never been identified by anyone who lived to tell the tale. When my director first proposed the undercover operation, I thought he was insane. Victor was dangerous, unpredictable, and ruthlessly violent. But I was also the only one who could do it. I had the right background, the right training, and the right face for the role. I spent 3 months inside his organization learning his patterns, building trust, earning his confidence. I watched him charm and manipulate and destroy everyone who got in his way. I saw him smile while ordering executions and laugh while planning betrayals. I learned to hate him with a cold, controlled hatred that never showed on my face. And now he was sitting on a plane with a broken handcuff and a flight attendant who had just revealed herself as his accomplice. Sophie's true identity had been buried deep in the airline's files. She had been recruited by Victor's organization during a time when she was desperate and vulnerable. Her mother had been dying of a rare disease, and the medical bills were crushing her. She had no money, no connections, and no hope until Victor's people found her. They offered her a deal she couldn't refuse: work for us, and we'll pay for your mother's treatment. She accepted without hesitation, and she had been working for them ever since. She had risen through the ranks of the airline, carefully positioning herself for this moment. When the cargo hatch opened and Victor's backup emerged, I realized the full scope of their plan. The man in the jumpsuit was a former military operative who had been dishonorably discharged for excessive force. He had been hired by Victor's organization 6 months earlier and had been waiting for this assignment ever since. They had planned everything down to the smallest detail: the timing, the location, the signals, the extraction route. The only variable they hadn't accounted for was me. I had been undercover for so long that I had forgotten how to be anything else. But in that moment when Victor's hands were free and his gun was raised, I remembered who I really was. The oxygen override had been a gamble. I had never used it before. I had only read about it in training manuals and seen it demonstrated in simulations, but I had a photographic memory for technical details, and I knew exactly which panel to access and which wires to cross. When I pulled the lever, I felt a surge of adrenaline that cleared my mind and focused my vision. I had 30 seconds to act, 30 seconds to end this before Victor could recover. I moved faster than I had ever moved in my life. I crossed the cabin in 3 strides, knocked the weapon from Victor's hand, and secured him before he could even register what was happening. Sophie was still gasping on the floor when I turned to her. She looked up at me with something between hatred and respect. "You're not like the others," she said. "I know." She laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "Neither am I." The next few hours were a blur of debriefing and paperwork. My director debriefed me in a sterile room with fluorescent lights and no windows. He asked the same questions over and over, and I gave the same answers. I had planned everything meticulously. The operation was a success. Victor was in custody, Sophie was in custody, and the network was beginning to unravel. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. Months later, I received a letter from Sophie. It was written on plain paper with no return address, and it had been smuggled out of her detention facility. The letter was short and to the point. "You think you won," she wrote, "but you have no idea what you're up against. Victor was just the beginning. There are others out there waiting for their moment, and when it comes, they won't make the same mistakes he did." I read the letter 3 times, then burned it in the fireplace. She was right about one thing. There would always be others. There would always be new threats, new enemies, new battles to fight. But I would be ready. I had survived Victor and Sophie and the chaos of that flight. I had survived 3 months of pretending to be someone I wasn't, and I had come out the other side stronger than before. The next case was already waiting for me when I walked into my office. My partner was sitting at his desk with a stack of files and a grim expression on his face. "We have a problem," he said. I sat down across from him. "What kind of problem?" "The kind that involves explosives and a lot of innocent people." I leaned forward and opened the first file. It was going to be a long day. But that was fine with me. I had been trained for this my entire life, and I was finally ready to do what I was meant to do. I thought about Sophie sometimes late at night when I couldn't sleep. I thought about her mother and the disease that had driven her to make such terrible choices. I didn't forgive her for what she had done, but I understood why she had done it, and that understanding made me a better detective. Victor's trial was a media circus. Reporters from every major network camped outside the courthouse for weeks. His lawyers tried every tactic: delay, disqualify, dismiss. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. The handcuffs, the wire, the testimony from Sophie and her accomplice. It was enough to put him away for life. Sophie's trial was quieter. She cooperated fully, giving detailed testimony about the network's structure and operations. In exchange, she received a reduced sentence. She would spend years in prison, but she would eventually be released. I didn't attend her sentencing. I couldn't bring myself to watch her walk away with a lighter punishment than she deserved, but I also couldn't bring myself to hate her anymore. The network that Victor and Sophie had been part of was eventually dismantled by a joint task force involving multiple agencies. It took years of painstaking work, but in the end, every major player was brought to justice. I was promoted after the case closed, not because I wanted recognition, but because my director insisted I deserved it. The promotion came with more responsibility and more paperwork, but also more freedom to pursue the cases that mattered. I never forgot what happened on that plane. I never forgot the feeling of helplessness when Victor broke free, or the surge of adrenaline when I took control again. Those moments shaped me into the detective I became. And when I look back on it now, I realize that the flight attendant wasn't the villain of the story. She was just another victim of a system that had failed her. She had been desperate, and desperate people do desperate things. Victor was the real villain. He had used Sophie's desperation against her the same way he had used everyone else in his life. But in the end, he was the one who lost. He was the one sitting in a cell while the rest of us moved on. I still have the broken handcuff somewhere in my desk drawer. I kept it as a reminder of what happened and why I do this job. The next time I boarded a plane, I sat in my seat and watched the flight attendants carefully. I studied their movements, their expressions, their interactions with passengers. I was looking for signs of deception, signs that someone else might be playing a longer game than I knew. I didn't find anything that flight or the flight after that or the one after that, but I kept watching. Because that was what I did. Now I watched and I waited and I was ready. And that was enough. Did she go far enough, or was she still too merciful? Comment justice if the ending was perfect. Comment harder if you wanted an even colder revenge. Your comments decide how ruthless the next ending should be. Like and subscribe if you want to be here for the next.